Hey, welcome back. So while we've been able to assemble some pretty nifty breakouts of our call center data using pivot tables, our actual calculations themselves have been pretty basic. Just counts, sums, and averages of numeric fields in our data. And to be sure, pivot tables aren't quite as flexible when it comes to crunching out complicated calculations as formulas and functions. However, there are a few tricks we can use to add some more nuanced metrics to our pivot table views. One such metric we might want to add is service level percentage, which is the percent of customer calls that were answered within an acceptable time frame, say 30 seconds. So if we look at the detailed data on our data worksheet, we'll see that we have a column called wait time, which tells us how long a customer had to wait before their call was answered. But how the heck can we translate this into a percentage of calls answered in 30 seconds that would appear in our pivot table? Well, one common approach in scenarios like this is to add a helper column or helper field to our detailed data that we can then use in our pivot to calculate the metric. So first I'm going to insert a new column to our table to the right of wait time. And I'm going to call this column service level met. And now in the column, I'm going to write an if statement that looks at our value in the wait time field. And if that wait time is 30 seconds or less, we'll return a 1, indicating that service level was met. And if not, we'll return a 0, indicating that it wasn't. So let's go ahead and type that out. Okay, so this is a step in the right direction, but how can we use this field in our pivot table to produce the percentage that we're looking for? Well, first let's try to drag it into our pivot table. So back to the worksheet that has our pivot table, I'll go to our field list, and then I'll look for our new field. But that's weird, I actually don't see our new field. Now why is that? So our new field is not appearing in our pivot table field list because our pivot table isn't actually directly tied to our source data in real time. Instead, when we created the pivot table, the source data was loaded into something called the pivot cache. This pivot cache is basically a copy of the data that the pivot table points to. Now what this means is that if we make changes to our pivot table's source data, the pivot doesn't update automatically, unlike with formulas and functions. So to see our new field, here under our Pivot Table Analyze tab, I'm going to want to click the down arrow under this refresh button, and then choose Refresh. And now if we scroll up our field list, we see our service level met field. So now I'll drag that into our values area. And then just to clean up our pivot table a little bit, I think I'll go ahead and remove these other metrics. So already this is providing us with some level of useful insight, which is basically a sum of all the calls that were answered at each site and by each manager and each employee respectively within that service level threshold we defined. But what we're looking for is a percentage. So how can we turn those ones and zeros into an actual percentage that will be reflected in our pivot? Well, it turns out it's actually really easy. All we actually have to do is summarize those ones and zeros as an average instead of a sum, and then format the result as a percentage. So if I do all that and click OK, and then once more, now we have the percentage of calls that were taken within 30 seconds at each level of hierarchy in our pivot table. Now it might not be completely intuitive as to how this works, so I'll take a second to explain the math behind it. Let's say you have 10 calls, and 9 of them were taken within 30 seconds and 1 was not. That means 9 of those calls would have gotten a 1 in our new service level met field, and 1 did not. So what happens when you take the average of 9 ones and 1 0? Well, if you add the 9 ones up, you get the number 9. Now to get your average, you take the sum of those numbers and divide by the total count of the numbers, which is 10. So 9 divided by 10 is 0.9. Then if you format that as a percent, you get 90%. And that's exactly how our percentages here are being calculated. If 88.18% of a certain subset of records had ones instead of zeros, that's the percentage we see in the pivot table. Generally speaking, whenever you have some kind of binary performance metric like this one, where some threshold of performance was either met or it wasn't, and you want to calculate the percentage of times it was or wasn't met in your pivot table, then this approach is an extremely effective one. And then just for some final cleanup, I'll go ahead and rename our new metric. And there we go. Now there is another feature called calculated fields, which allow us to bake these derived fields directly into our pivot table. But to be honest with you, they don't offer nearly the same flexibility for doing calculations as derived fields in our source data, and they're also a little bit clunky to work with. If you want to add derived calculations directly into your pivot tables, there's a much better way to do it than calculated fields, but that involves a relatively new feature in Excel called Power Pivot and a whole new formula language called DAX. Now that's a whole other topic in and of itself that's a lot more than we can go into here. It's honestly a topic worthy of its own course. So for now, I'd recommend the approach of adding calculated fields to your detailed data and then summarizing them creatively in your pivot table. Now, one other way to put a different spin on the counts and totals in your pivot tables are to summarize them as percentages rather than straight numbers. So let me show you what I mean. If we drag our call ID field back into our pivot and then summarize it as a count, and then I'll just name it calls answered. Now we have a breakout of the number of calls answered at every level of hierarchy in our pivot. But what if I wanted to show these values as a percent of a whole? Well, Excel actually makes this really easy. So if I right-click any value in that column, and then hover over Show Values As, one popular option we can choose is percent of column total. Now that makes sense in this particular situation because we have our metrics oriented in columns and not rows. If our metrics were oriented towards rows, and our categorical fields like site and manager were oriented by columns, we'd instead choose percent of row total. But if I click this percent of column total, now the number next to each individual row label reflects that particular item's contribution to the overall total. So for example, Aurora, Colorado took 34.34% of all calls taken at all three of our sites. Jacksonville, Florida took 35.93%, Spokane, Washington took 29.73%, and then if we go all the way down to our grand total, it adds up to 100%. And we see similar breakouts for individual managers. So Jamar Prall's team here took 11% of our overall call volume. And then that breakdown continues to the level of the individual employee. Now another approach we can take, if we right-click any number in this column again and hover over Show Values As, is to display our numbers not as a percent of the overall total, but as a percent of the total of the parent group. So if I choose percent of parent row total, now we see some more meaningful numbers at the lower levels of hierarchy in our pivot. For example, instead of seeing tiny percentages next to each individual employee, which while accurate, don't give us a picture of how these employees are doing relative to their peers, we now instead see the number of calls each employee took as a percentage of the calls taken by their team. So if I highlight all these percentages under LC Taplin and then look down at the status bar, you'll see they add up to 100%. That's because under this mode of summarization, individual numbers are shown as a percentage of the total in the parent group. Likewise, if we added the percentages of Elsie Taplin, Nova Harshberger, Rana Taub, and Shayla Lyon, they would add up to 100%. That 100% being the number of calls taken at the Aurora, Colorado site. Either of these approaches can be valid depending on your particular use case. Okay, now that you have a strong foundation in pivot tables, in the next section we'll build on that foundation by exploring how we can summarize multiple data sets in a single pivot table using a revolutionary new feature called the Excel data model. I'll see you then.